Hello, COS supporters, and welcome back to another edition of COS Live. My name is Andrew Luce. I will be your host, and of course, I am joined by my co-host, Rita Peters, who is also the Senior Vice President of Legislative Affairs. Rita, it's been a while since we've been together on an episode like this. It's great to be back with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Andrew. And yeah, I've missed our little times of getting together to do this program. So excited that we can do this today. And I think our viewers are going to be quite entertained by today's program.
I think so too, Rita. Hopefully, our viewers won't get too disgusted with what we're going to be looking at, but I'm pretty sure that we're going to have a good time debunking a lot of the things that we have in store for our viewers. So, with that, Rita, we had a hearing in Ohio recently on June 4th, and it was in the House Government Oversight Committee, and they were looking at HJR 3, which is our resolution for term limits, fiscal restraints, and limiting the jurisdiction of the federal government. And if this resolution was passed, it would it would be added to the 19 states that have already called for a convention of states. But there's a little catch on this one, Rita. This hearing was not opponents and proponents and others. It was strictly opponent testimony. So usually when we cover hearings, we're doing a bit of analysis on the good, the bad, and the ugly. But in this case, it was just all ugly because it was opponent testimony only. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of the bad, the ugly, and the uglier, looking at some of those clips. But Rita, before we get to that, can you catch our viewers up on why Ohio does things a little differently than other states?
Yeah, well, as you pointed out, it is different, Andrew, because in most states, when we have a committee hearing, the committee will first call the sponsors up to introduce the bill, and then they'll hear from proponents and opponents. It's just public testimony. So usually folks will have to sign up as either for the bill or against the bill. Sometimes the chair will do all of the proponents first and then hear from all of the opponents and then let our sponsor do, rebuttal and a closing speech. Well, Ohio is very different. They like to have lots of hearings there, for better, for worse. So they start with a sponsors hearing. So the very first hearing is just for the sponsors to introduce the bill to the committee. And we had that in Ohio last year. Then the next hearing is generally only for the proponents of the bill. And we had that hearing back in February. We broadcast that. And, that's where all of our Convention of State supporters show up and testify, and the committee gets to hear from them. Then the next thing that happens in Ohio is what we're going to show today, and that's the opponents hearing. So that's when the committee hears from everybody in the public who wants to show up and oppose the bill. And today, that's what we're going to see.
So, Rita, I got to ask, why should we be showing opponent testimony to our viewers? I mean, why should our viewers want to hear opponents trash the Constitution, trash Convention of States, trash the founding, trash the Constitutional Convention? Why should we broadcast this to our viewers?
Well, let me just say that producer G has done everyone a big favor in going through and just taking some select clips of the opponent's testimony. So you don't have to sit through all of it. You're only going to hear some of those terrible things you just mentioned, Andrew. But, the reason we want to do this, we're not afraid of the naysayers. We've heard the same talking points for years in hearing after hearing after hearing. So, we're going to play a few of the representative clips to give you a flavor of the opposition and show you some of their tactics of confusing the issue and actually arguing in favor of the status quo, which is a bloated federal government and a corrupt ruling class that suffocates we the people. And after we show you each clip, Andrew and I are going to react and kind of rebut their comments and give you a glimpse of how you might do that when you are hit with these opposition talking points. Because again, there's never anything new. They're always the
Hmm.
same.
Right? Nothing new under the sun. Rita,
Right.
you said something really, really important, confusing the issue, because we hear often that, why haven't we got to 34 yet? What's taking so long for this convention thing to finally get going? And part of the problem is that year after year, we have people coming up out of the woodwork, going to the state legislatures and testifying in front of legislators saying this thing's going to run away and this is dangerous, and they spew lies and all kinds of stuff like that. And that's all on top of the fact that we have to pass our resolution, our legislation in 34 states, and it has to be identical. So this is a hard enough task in and of itself. But then we have people out there who are parroting Soros-funded organizations who are hell-bent on stopping us from achieving our goal. And it's so interesting because many of them claim to be conservatives, but they're standing with far-left organizations and George Soros-funded lobbyists. And Producer G has put together an amazing video that shows you a side-by-side comparison of George Soros-funded lobbyists right next to JBS leadership, and they're saying the same exact thing. Producer G, we need to show our viewers a few clips from this video.
And just for the record, I represent the John Birch Society in opposition of this, so I want to put that out there forward.
On behalf of Common Cause, to express our opposition to H 5188, that would add Rhode Island to the list of the 19 other states that have called for an Article 5 constitutional convention.
I am the field coordinator for the John Birch Society for the state of Montana.
My name is Robert Brown.
My name is Jeff Foster, and I'm the executive director at Common Cause Massachusetts, where we've joined with the League of Women Voters, ACLU, the Massachusetts Teachers Association, AFSCME Council 93, and many more to oppose any Article 5 Convention of States.
The resolution is promoted by people who want the power to do as they please without federal intervention.
So talk about radical change.
The threat to the convention is the complete collapse of American democracy.
Have a constitutional convention to rewrite our Constitution.
A1 of a convention that could rewrite the Constitution.
Once the convention is seated, it would be the highest law of the land, and it could do as it pleases.
It would open the door of any convention of the states for a wholesale rewrite.
We might instead get a new Constitution.
Rewriting our nation's founding document wholesale.
These resolutions put our Constitution at grave risk.
Is it worth the risk?
Such a convention would put every American's fundamental rights and civil liberties at risk.
And all of our carefully crafted freedoms and liberties at risk.
Why would we risk going into it?
That there's no effective mechanism of limiting the scope.
Any constitutional issue could be brought up.
States cannot limit the agenda of a constitutional convention.
Their state legislatures have no authority to limit the power or scope of their delegates.
And it is widely understood that a convention, once called, will be able to consider any amendments that the delegates want to consider.
The applications must be recognized as an application for an unlimited convention where everything's on the table.
The Constitution should be amended the old-fashioned way by having Congress pass by a 2/3 margin in the House and Senate.
Congress is actually very responsive to the will of their constituents.
That will take back the Congress and will cut this spending.
We'd much prefer amendment by amendment process without a convention for any changes in the Constitution.
It would be good if Congress would just take care of these issues for us, ma'am, and then we wouldn't be here talking about it.
As you can see, they just make shoddy claims and flat out lies, and both organizations or both sides are saying the same exact thing, that this is dangerous, that there's a runaway convention that happened in 1787, and that it'll happen again if you hold another convention. And there's all kinds of myths and lies that are put out there about what we do at Convention of States and about Article 5. So Rita, we're going to go through some of the clips that Producer G put together from that opponent testimony back on June 4th. But before we get to that, can you give our viewers just like a kind of like a synopsis of how we got to where we're at right now in Ohio, and just kind of get our viewers caught up?
Sure, Andrew. Well, as you mentioned earlier, 19 state legislatures have already passed this resolution calling for an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution on 3 topics: fiscal restraints, term limits, and limits on the federal scope and jurisdiction. We need 34 states to pass it, so just 15 states to go to call the first ever Article 5 convention and finally rein in DC. Currently, there are 21 additional states that have introduced our resolution in 2024, including Ohio. The Convention of States Ohio volunteer team has been super busy building support across the state and in the legislature. They've been holding town halls, participating in parades, doing everything they can to get the word out there about this effort. Over 113,000 Ohioans have signed the COS petition. The COS Ohio team actually has one of the largest state teams in the nation for Convention of States, and I've been there and worked with them, and I can tell you that team is second to none. Now, we've had committee hearings before in Ohio, but have never reached the floor for a full vote. The Ohio team is persistent, and persistence is what it takes to win in politics. By continuing to build relationships with their legislators and educating those legislators, they're working to make some major legislative progress this year. As I mentioned earlier, there was a proponent hearing held in February, and the COS Ohio team just packed the room. Dozens of Ohioans gave oral and written testimony. And Andrew, I think I actually counted the number of people who filed written testimony in favor of Convention of States with this committee, and it was 64. I believe the number who filed written testimony opposed to Convention of States was 7. And there were only a handful of opponents even present at the opponents' hearing. What you're about to see, you'll be able to see that the room is not full, as opposed to the way it was during the proponents' hearing, which we had a totally packed house. So that gives you a little bit of background, Andrew.
Thanks, Rita. So that brings us up to date on Convention of States progress in Ohio. So let's move over to the 5 clips that producer G has put together for us today. And again, like Rita said, this is opposition testimony only. And Rita is going to give analysis on some of the things that are said in these clips, being our expert at Convention of States. She is the Vice President for Legislative Affairs. So Rita, your comments on this are going to be invaluable for viewers. And hopefully our viewers will be able to use some of your expertise when they're in the field, because you know what? If you go out there and talk about Convention of States, you better bet that there's going to be someone from JBS who's going to pop up out of the woodwork and start talking about all of the myths and lies out there. Okay, Rita, let's get to the first clip. This first one's going to be about fiscal restraints. Producer G, please roll that first clip.
In terms of this bill, SJR3, being unnecessary, let's look at the exact wording of this bill, okay? It says, House Joint Resolution 3 calls for the convening of an Article 5 convention, or CONCON, for the purpose of imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government. The Constitution and 10th Amendment do that already, folks. It's also for the purpose of limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. The Constitution and 10th Amendment do that already. And it also calls for term limits, okay? You know, in terms of term limits, we have them already. They're called elections at the federal level every 2 years in the House, every 6 years in the Senate.
Rita, what do you think about his "we already have that already" comment?
Well, I have to back up and say I love the book shaking. You know, everybody loves to have a book waved at them. Okay, so Andrew, he says the Constitution and 10th Amendment already limit the federal government. Well, yes, but does anyone think those limitations have proven to be sufficient? If you think so, then I can see why you wouldn't support Convention of States. Everything's fine, right? But if you think that additional restrictions and limitations on DC are needed, then Convention of States is the only way we're going to get them, because Congress is never going to limit itself, that's for sure. The other point I want to make, Andrew, he says term limits are unnecessary because we have elections. And we hear this a lot, but it's really an oversimplification. Yes, it is possible for us to vote out politicians we don't like, but only if someone runs against them and only if that person has the means of getting their message out so we know about them. The fact is, incumbents have an incredible advantage over challengers. They have the name recognition, they have the campaign funds that they continue to build during their time in office. And the longer they're in office, the more of those benefits they have. So I believe, and by the way, an overwhelming majority of the American people believe that term limits are necessary. But again, Congress is never going to impose those on itself. We need a convention of states.
Yeah, Rita, I think we should encourage every person at JBS wave books at legislators in their face and definitely be as condescending as possible in front of legislators. That's very influential. Please do that.
They like that. Mm-hmm.
One real quick comment, and then we'll go to clip 2 is I don't understand the whole term limits thing being the same thing as elections. I mean, we have constitutionally mandated term limits for the president, and we don't call that an election.
There you go.
Really weird. It's very bizarre.
Yep.
I've always thought this whole thing of we have term limits. It's called elections is a really bizarre claim.
Yeah.
All right, Rita. Let's go to clip 2. This one's on rescissions.
This resolution seems to be coming back every session, and I believe it has. I've looked back. I think it's 5 sessions in a row. Some form of Convention of States resolution has been submitted. Interestingly, the dangers of this that we're going to talk about today, and we've already started, they haven't changed. So none of the issues or concerns really have changed over that period of time. However, since just 2022, at least 3 more states have rescinded their previous COS applications. That's Illinois, New Jersey, and New York. And the Missouri application actually expired. So there, one step forward, 2 steps back in some respects. New Hampshire actually passed it in the state legislature, and they're looking for the Senate to rescind their previous applications as well. So there's definitely a movement to rescind previous applications because people are starting to realize of these dangers, not just this movement to encourage state legislatures to pass a convention of states, which is actually an Article 5 convention, and there is a difference.
All right, Rita, what do you think about clip 2?
Poor Mr. Tuttle. He is just confused, Andrew. He's talking about states that have rescinded Article 5 applications. Many of them are rescinding applications that they passed back in the 1800s or, 50 years ago. None of the states he names have ever passed our Article 5 application for a convention to propose amendments that impose fiscal restraints, limit federal power, and set term limits. So none of those rescissions affect our effort in the least. What Mr. Tuttle doesn't seem to understand is that the topic for amendments specified by the state applications matters. And this is the same reason we don't need to worry about some crazy amendment coming out of convention. The topic of amendment proposals is limited to the subject matter that the states specify when they apply. They are setting the agenda for the convention. Tuttle mentions that the Missouri application expired, and there he is talking about our Article 5 application in Missouri, but he didn't do his homework because, in fact, while the original Missouri application contained an expiration date, Missouri passed a new application in 2021, removing the expiration date. There it is, right there on the screen. Producer G has it for us. That's the legislative website in Missouri showing you the record of their passing in 2021 a new Convention of States application that removes that expiration date. So unfortunately, Andrew, Mr. Tuttle just isn't credible. He just didn't do his homework, just doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, that's a common thing that we see, failure to do homework. All right. The next clip is going to be something related to the founding fathers. Producer G, can you run clip 3?
Well, if you take a look at the people who were actually opposed to a convention of states or an Article 5 convention, it's a pretty darn impressive list. And in fact, it's people we ought to be listening to. So, for example, who better to advise us than people that were actually there? James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, our first Supreme Court Chief Justice, all wrote against or talked about the dangers of an Article 5 convention if one took place later.
All right, I'm guessing Mr. Tuttle did his homework this time. At least he got their names right.
He did, and it looks like Mr. Tuttle maybe did some reading. He just didn't do enough, Andrew. Again, doesn't have his facts straight. He mentions James Madison and Alexander Hamilton as being opposed to an Article 5 convention. It's just not true. I'm sure that all of the writings he's mentioned have been taken out of context because that is what our opponents tend to do with the founding fathers' early writings on that subject. But just to make it abundantly clear, here are some of their writings that manifest their confidence in the Article 5 convention process as the means for the states to rein in the federal government if it becomes overbearing, which of course we know was the original purpose of them including the convention process in Article 5 in the first place. So here, this first one, this is a letter written by James Madison. I think it was 1830. And it says, should the provisions of the Constitution, as here reviewed, be found not to secure the government and rights of the states against usurpations and abuses on the part of the United States, the final resort within the purview of the Constitution lies in an amendment of the Constitution according to a process applicable by the states. And of course, there he's talking about the Article 5 convention process. And I think we have one other shot of something. This one is by Alexander Hamilton. And if you look at that final highlighted portion, Alexander Hamilton says, we may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority. And this is in the context of his discussion about the Article 5 convention, as you can see there in the other highlighted portions. So sorry, Mr. Tuttle, you just need to read a little bit more. I'm sure you mean well. Just need to read a little more.
A little bit more. He really should have read that one because his whole point was John Jay, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. They talked about the dangers. Now, I'm no expert, but Hamilton said safely, and I'm pretty sure safely means what it says, that it's safe to use this. So anyway.
I just wonder, Andrew, and I really don't know the answer to the question, but has he really just not seen these other writings? In which case he really just didn't do his homework, or has he seen them, but he's just intentionally misleading the committee by just, picking out a couple, which he didn't even share which quotes he's talking about in his testimony. And I'm sure I can guess which ones they are because I've seen the ones that the JBS folks typically do pull out of context and twist them, to mean what they want them to mean. But it's just frustrating when this happens time and time again.
Super frustrating. All right, we go over to clip 4. Now we're going to be talking about Soros funding the Article 5 movement. Ooh,
scary.
The globalist financier George Soros, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, is also funding the Move to Amend coalition and the Young Turks, who are joining ranks with many of those clamoring for a con. This includes groups like the Alliance for Democracy, the Center for Media and Democracy, Code Pink, Independent Progressive Politics Network, the Sierra Club, and others. So this is definitely a top-down, money-driven attempt by ruling elites to push the idea of an Article 5 convention. One has to wonder if the low-level activists really understand what they are essentially being bribed to support. And what about the politicians? They say money is the mother's milk of politics. Are the elite advocates of a con showering politicians with money to buy their support?
All right, Rita, what do you think?
Okay, Mr. Healy is way off base here. Did you hear him say that leftist organizations are clamoring for a convention? And did you hear him include, I'm just going to name two of them, Center for Media and Democracy and the Sierra Club, among others? Well, that would be a shock to those organizations, Andrew, to learn that he thinks they're clamoring for a convention, because they are actually among the hundreds of leftist, George Soros funded organizations that have issued a press release in opposition to Convention of States. It is just maddening. So here we have the statement. Thanks, Producer G. And I think this is the statement and the listing of all these leftist organizations that are opposed to Convention of States. There you see highlighted Center for Media and Democracy. Okay, there we have the Sierra Club. And we could list more, because after this listing of national organizations, it breaks down into listing of state leftist organizations. And it goes on and on and on. But how much clearer can it get, Andrew, that what he's saying is false? He is saying these organizations are clamoring for a convention. The organizations are signing their name to a statement of opposition. Okay, this is not he said, she said kind of thing. This is demonstrably false, what he is telling people. And then I have to make one other comment, Andrew, because did you hear him refer to our grassroots volunteers as low-level activists whom he says are being bribed? Well, our activists are anything but low level. They are the heart and soul of our organization, and we on the national team are here for the purpose of supporting and serving them. I don't know how Mr. Healy thinks we're bribing them, but that is just a slap in the face to the hundreds of thousands of patriots who are giving of their time, talent, and treasure to try to save our republic. So I just want to say, shame on you, Mr. Healy.
You know what's really sad about it too is behind him in the frame is state director for Ohio, Bill Scott.
Yep.
And Bill Scott is a true American patriot, as are all of our volunteers. And he's back there, and I looked at this video, and you know what I saw? He didn't have a face of disgust. It didn't bother him at all. At least you couldn't see it on his face. And that just shows you the servant leader mindset that that state director has, Bill Scott. And being criticized that way and being lambasted like that is just really not okay. And so I completely agree with you. And the one thing too about getting back to the leftist organizations, because you got to make the claim, well, all right, well, George Soros released this press release and all of these organizations are against Convention of States. But secretly, they actually want a Convention of States and they're funding the project. I mean, that makes no sense at all. You have to believe in conspiracy theories, and you have to believe that George Soros and Convention of States are playing 4D chess to try and, put up smoke screens to not so that people don't catch on that this is actually George Soros who's funding this entire thing. It's just all it is it's an attempt to confuse and obfuscate the issue. That's really what it is, and that's all it is. All right, let's go over to our last clip that we have for our viewers. We got a true scholar who's going to talk about Article 5.
When I sat in here and listened to the proponent testimony, I kept hearing
people talking about this guy's a constitutional scholar and this guy's a constitutional scholar. And it always made me wonder what qualifies somebody as a constitutional scholar. I mean, I wrote both my master's and my doctorate on the founding of this nation. So as I'm hearing a lot of this testimony, and even some of the people that are coming up don't have the qualifications to call somebody a constitutional scholar. But if you're going to call yourself a constitutional scholar, you really have to read and understand at least 6 documents: Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, the Journal of the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution itself, the Federalist Papers, and the Anti-Federalist Papers. If you read those and understand those, you have a great understanding of how this country was framed and how it was started.
All right. Well, he says that he's the true constitutional scholar. Bye-bye, Mike Ferris. I'm the real scholar.
Okay, I really like this one. So, Dr. John Diamond wants to debate credentials. Well, this is an exercise that we welcome because here's something I can agree with the opposition about, and that is if you're going to call yourself a constitutional scholar, you've got to have the chops to back it up. Now, I noticed that he doesn't really give his own credentials, except that we did hear he has a master's degree in something and a doctoral degree in something. And he has read 6 particular historical documents, which I would agree are important to read. But he's throwing shade at the qualifications of our experts, the Convention of States experts. That's really his point here. So let's look at just a couple of the Convention of States experts and their credentials. And by the way, I want to point out that these biographies that producer G is going to put up for us were not written by Convention of States, but by just a couple of the outside organizations led by our experts. So this first one is Michael Ferris. And this, I think, comes from the Patrick Henry College website, a college which Michael Ferris founded, and he currently serves as the Chancellor Emeritus. He also founded the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And, you look here and see all of these accomplishments of Michael Ferris. Well, it's not even all of them. It's really just a little taste of them. But he has been a professor of constitutional law for many years. He has written so many books. I can't see the number there at the moment, but he's written so many books. He's produced educational videos on the Constitution. He's argued cases before the United States Supreme Court, including an Article 5 case that he argued not before the Supreme Court, but in the federal court system. He is an expert if anyone was ever an expert. So, that's number one. And then I think we've got a little bit of Professor Rob Natelson. And what's funny is, Andrew, this is taken from the Federalist Society, which is a highly influential conservative organization in the United States. And look at the first sentence there. Robert G. Natelson is one of America's best known constitutional scholars. It pretty much directly refutes what this Dr. John Diamond says about our experts, not having the credentials to be considered constitutional scholars. So Professor Natelson taught law for 23 years at the University of Montana, taught constitutional law. And, the one part of his bio that I like to point out, it's the most impressive thing to me, is he is one of the most frequently cited scholars by the United States Supreme Court. His works have been repeatedly cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. He is an expert not only in Article 5, he is the author of the only legal treatise on Article 5, which is called The Law of Article 5. But he has also written books and law review articles on many other aspects of the Constitution. So again, if anyone is an expert, Professor Rob Nadelson is an expert. So, I just think it's pretty silly for anyone to get up and claim that our Convention of States experts aren't real experts. We have seen it done before. In fact, in a COS Live that I recorded recently, another person specifically says that Rob Nadelson is a false scholar. And again, it's just an outrageous lie.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's what I got.
You know what's funny, Rita, is who also knows that Rob Nadelson and Michael Ferris are experts? Our grassroots, our volunteers. Whenever they go to testify before a legislature, they always cite Michael Ferris, Robert Nadelson. They never claim to be experts. And in fact, they will often preface their testimony with, I'm not an expert. I just support this thing. I'm a leader in the grassroots side, but I'm not an expert in this. You don't hear that from JBS. They claim to be experts without the credentials. They don't point to other experts. They point to themselves.
Yes.
So that ought to tell you everything you need to know about what credentials they have, that's always just baffled me that they have like the audacity to come up and say, Michael Ferris is not an expert, but I am.
Right. And it's so true. And Andrew, I just want to point out again that this is something that actually does matter. When you're dealing with an area of the Constitution, constitutional law, or history that you are not an expert in, it's really important to decide who out there who's claiming to be an expert is really credible and can be trusted. So, I would always encourage people to do that because not everyone has the time to invest in researching all the nuances of law and history, that what Rob Nadelson and Mike Ferris have done in order to reach their conclusions and publish books on the topic and peer-reviewed law journal articles on the topic. So if you don't have the time to do all that, which some of the opponents who testified clearly didn't have the time to do, you need to find a credible, trustworthy expert, and we've got them.
Mm-hmm. We definitely do. All right, Rita, well, we don't have any more clips to play. I don't think my stomach could handle another one. So thank the Lord that we're out of clips, and we're also out of time. So we're going to have to leave it there. We did show the bad, the ugly, and the uglier. And hopefully next time we jump on, we'll be sharing good news, and we'll be showing our COS activists in the field going in front of legislators and testifying on behalf of Convention of States. Hopefully we'll get to see that in our next COS Live edition. Until then, you can learn more about Convention of States, and you can learn more about the facts that support Article 5, our Constitution, the founding, the 1787 Convention by going to www.conventionofstates.org/facts. That's www.conventionofstates.org/facts to learn more. Well, Rita, it's been a pleasure jumping on to this special broadcast with you. Thank you so much for giving your expertise in all of these clips and helping us and helping our viewers to have some ammunition when they're in the field. We got a country to save, though, Rita, so it's time for us to get back to work.